Welcome everyone to this week's webinar. I'm Paul Lefevre, the Xojo Developer Evangelist. This week we're going to be talking about the user interface controls you can use with web applications. This is a little bit more of a laid-back webinar than some of the other ones, so feel free to ask lots of questions. Next week is our Xojo Developer Conference, and I needed a webinar I didn't have to do quite as much prep work for. So hopefully that works out well for everyone. So let's open up a sample web app right here. All right, get ourselves a web app open, and you can see over here in the library on the right hand side are a list of all the controls that are available to add to a web page. So we're going to kind of go through these, talk about them. I have several sample projects we'll open up and look at. If you have any questions on a particular control, feel free to ask while we're talking about it, or later. If you think about the question later, that's fine. We'll go ahead and dive in. Let's see here. So as you know, when you've used the library before, you can group the controls by having the group headings appear above them, which I kind of like. If you don't have that, you can turn that on just by picking the show group banners here in the library view. And of course, you have different ways you can display the controls in the library. By default, I believe they show as these large icons. But I like the small icons with the descriptions, makes it easy for me to find things. And then I also then hide the little hover window that shows the larger description, since I don't really need to see it. So it gives me more stuff on the screen at once that I can see. And in case you're not aware, stuff in the library can be found just by typing. So I can start typing right now. Select something in here, and now see I can start typing text, and I'm not in the search field or anything. I'm just typing, and it'll highlight whatever one I happen to type out, which is a great way to find something. And of course, you can use the filter field to show all the controls that have a certain common string in them to group them or whatnot. So that's how you can find the controls, but you all pretty much know that at this point, I'm sure, if you've been watching these webinars. So let's go through some of the controls. The button control, obviously, incredibly simple control, and one you're going to use in just about every application you're going to build, because people need to be able to click on things to initiate actions, and that's what a button is for. And speaking of which, the primary event handler associated with the button is the action event handler. And as with any other button that you may have used in a desktop application, when the button is clicked, the action event handler is called, and you can write your code in there, and the code gets run when the button is pressed by the user. Now, when you run projects that have just a standard default button on them, the layout of the button takes on the appearance of whatever browser you're using and whatever the platform standards are for that particular browser. So here on OS X Mavericks, this is what a particular button looks like. And you can see clicking it just displays the message box. But you can, of course, customize your buttons very, very greatly. And I'm going to open up a little example project here. By using styles. You can use styles to completely customize how your buttons look and operate. So you can see here I got a couple just regular buttons I dragged on here. But this button here has been heavily modified with some styles, which are all in this button 1 style that I've created, and we'll look at in a moment. But let's run this so you can see what this actually looks like in the browser. So you can see it doesn't look anything like the standard default button. I changed the background color and the rounded corners and everything else. You can see when I hover over it, the text becomes bold, and when I click on the button, the text changes to a different shade of blue. Now, those may not be the best colors in the world, but they're more to show off what you can do here. So this is what a style might look like that has a fully customized button. And you can see all kinds of style properties have been added to this particular style. First of all, I added all the corner properties, and I set them to be 25-point corners, which gives the nice rounded effect that you saw on that particular button. I set a very simple border for each of the border types, so there's a nice thin border around the button. I changed the background color, and I reduced the font size ever so slightly. So that changes the overall initial look out of the button, the layout or appearance of the button when it first appears on the web page. But there are other properties you can tweak, and this particular one I went to the hover section, and these are the properties that will take effect when the mouse cursor hovers over the button. And in this case, I said, well, make the font become bold when we're just hovering over it. When we're actually pressing it, we can change the background to be a different color. And you could do whatever you want here. You could change the text color, you could change the border, background, whatever makes sense for the layout you're trying to achieve. But that's how you would do that and start to get some buttons that maybe look a little more stylish for the application you're trying to create. All right, we'll leave the button right here. Let's drag over another type of button, which is a segmented control. And this is kind of a single control that has multiple buttons in it. And you can see here in the inspector that you can specify the number of segments, or if you will, the number of buttons that appear in the segmented control. And you can just change the number and add more buttons for the user to push. We can click the little edit, put it in edit mode. You can click on each of the parts, and then you get its own properties that show up in the inspector. And then when you run a project with these type of segmented control on it, you can click on the individual parts. Now, this type of control has a variety of uses, selecting different options. One nice use is creating a kind of tab panel, because web apps by default don't have tab panels in them. So you can use a segmented control to kind of act as the tab, and then switch different viewable containers, if you will, to pretend that you're dealing with a tab. So you can see here this kind of does that. When you click the first segmented control, these sub-controls end up being displayed, and when you click this one here, this whole different set appears. So that's a great use of a segmented control. And you can see how that works is it also has an action event handler, and you can just check which button happens to be selected using the selected property or method, I guess it is in this case, when passing in a particular number to see which segment is selected. And then you can display what you want. And this particular one is just displaying the first tab information and then hiding the second, and doing the opposite when the other one's clicked. So all in all, pretty simple, but a great use of containers and a great way to create a tab effect in your web applications. The toolbar is a great little control, or big control, as you can see as I'm dragging it over here. And this works a little differently than the desktop one. Desktop toolbars are actually project items that you add over in the navigator to your project and then drag them onto a window. In the case of the web, they're actually controls that appear in the library that you can drag directly onto a window. And then you can also interact with it right within the web page, excuse me, not the window, the web page layout. So I can click the button here, and I get a little plus sign that shows up over here, and I can add certain things to the toolbar: a button, a menu, a separator, a space, a flexible space, or a container. And a container is a really nice thing because it allows you to add your own controls to the toolbar. So you could create a container control, put in another control in it, like say a search field, and then be able to add that container to the toolbar, and the end result is you're able to put a search field in a toolbar. So that's very nice. And you can see as you add stuff here, we'll switch over to the inspector. As you click on the individual items, you get to see the properties that are associated with them. And you can add all sorts of stuff to see what they look like, of course. But I think I have an actual bigger project with a toolbar. Let's open that up. So we can take a look at this project here, see what this looks like. So you can see this has a toolbar up here, icons, click on things and track what's clicked. This one is a menu, so it drops down a menu with different options that you can choose. And you can see stuff that appears on the right-hand side. This would be the items you add to the toolbar that appear after a flexible space control that's added to it. And you can see right here is a search field that has been added as part of a container, and then a regular help button. So let's open this up. So you can see there are a couple action event handlers on a toolbar that allow you to do your thing when certain things are clicked. Button action is called when just standard buttons are clicked. In this particular toolbar, there's 3 buttons that are just regular buttons that you can click on. So it can check these, and it can check the name of the button, and then do what it needs to do. Here it's just displaying which one you clicked. Of course, normally you'd call your own methods that are doing the actions associated with the button. Buttons that have menus associated with them end up calling the menu action event handler, which tells you which menu on the which button on the toolbar was clicked, and then which menu item within it was clicked, so that you can see here that it's checking that the charts button was clicked and then telling you which menu item was selected from it. Same with the dates menu. And if we look at the open event handler, this is where the menus are set up ahead of time so that they're properly displayed when they're clicked. And pretty standard stuff here. You're just creating a new instance of each item that you want to add to the menu for the menu button, and then you append it to the appropriate button. Now, if we go back to this, I'm clicking right now. I put the toolbar in edit mode, and I'm clicking on the container. And you can see right here that it has as its super web toolbar container, and the target is search field, which you can see over here, looking in the navigator, is a web container that we've previously created and is in the project already. So that's how you specify which container is going to appear in the toolbar. And if you look at the search field, you can see it. It's pretty simple. It's just a small container control that has other controls added to it. In this case, it just has a single search field added to it. But that's how that appears in the toolbar, which is very handy. And of course, you could stick whatever makes sense to put in the toolbar in this manner, but you could certainly add things like pop-up menus, other standard controls that are available to you that we'll be talking about soon. You end up throwing in a container, and then you'd be able to display them in the toolbar if that made sense for the type of user interface you're trying to build. All right, let's move on to the next section, the picker controls. These allow you to make a selection of some kind from information. The first 2 are pretty simple, just some scroll bars. They don't do anything super exciting. you can move them around and get a value indicator for how far they've been moved that you can then use to display other information or whatnot. So I won't actually even bother running that particular example. And then vertical and horizontal for how they just appear on the screen. Checkbox, of course, is a very useful control, usually for selecting options of some kind. You can see it looks pretty standard. The checkbox has just a single property for its value, and it can be on or off, so checked or not checked. Pop-up menu is another very useful control for allowing users to pick a value from multiple values. This control, when you click it, drops down a list of items, and the user can pick one of the items, and you can then see which one they picked. This type of control you're going to want to use for, you're not going to want to use, I should say, for items that are tons and tons of values for the user to choose from, because scrolling through this list can be a little unwieldy from a user interface standpoint. So you want to have a small set of things for the user to pick from if you're using a pop-up menu. Radio group is an interesting one, so let's drag that one on here. Unlike the desktop radio button control, which is just a single radio button, which by itself is not terribly useful, the web applications use a radio group, which always starts with at least 2 items, and you can add more. And you can control them by the number of columns and the number of rows. So I added 2 columns, but still 2 rows, and you can see that they're now added for you automatically. And because they're treated as a group, you don't have to worry about if I added a second radio group to this layout, that the settings would be interfering with the other settings. They're completely isolated. So I think I have a project here, so let me open that up. And as you might expect, you're able to tell, of course, which items were clicked. There's a few different ways to do that. Primarily, you're going to take advantage of the selection changed event handler. And there's a variety of ways to determine which item in the radio group was selected. The slightly tricky thing that radio groups used is if you use the selected cell property to get back which cell was selected, you can see down here by looking at the bottom that it returns a data type of a pair, which means it's essentially returning 2 values. And it's returning the left column, or the left value. It returns 2 values. Let me start at the beginning. It returns 2 values, what is called a left value and what is called a right value. And they're accessed using the left and right properties, as I'm doing here. In this particular case, the left value is the row that was selected, and the right value is the column that was selected. So with that information, essentially the return value of the row and column of the selected cell, you can then do cases or if statements or whatnot to determine which item was selected and then act accordingly. All right, so that's radio group. And slider, as you may have used, is also a control that you can just slide around and get a value back as it's moved, or after it's moved more likely, that you can then use for something. Controlling color levels, sound levels in a web app may not make as much sense, but something like that is a good use of a slider. Let's add a clean web page for our next set of controls. The input section has a variety of text controls, and it looks like there's a lot here, but really these are mostly just variations on a theme. And the primary one is the text field, which is a single line field that allows you to type in text. Again, a very commonly used control. You almost always have to have your users type information of some kind, often with a web app login. So these fields would be used for the user to type in a username and password, for example. And speaking of which, there are a few pre-assigned text fields, if you will, here that have certain formatting controls associated with them. Password field is obviously the one that will display the little stars as users typing in them so that you can't see the password. And then some of these other ones primarily work on iOS because they use iOS's built-in formatting capabilities to limit what's typed in the field for email addresses, numbers, telephones, URLs, that sort of thing. For larger blocks of text, you can use a text area, which is a multi-line control. You can type in all kinds of stuff in here. There's no formatting or anything like that like you can do on the desktop side. It's really just a giant, almost like a text editor, if you will, that user can type in all kinds of stuff, enter multiple lines, and display it all nicely with word wrap and that sort of thing. The search field displays a kind of a rounded box with a search field, often used with web apps. It's a common search is commonly associated with web, so this is the type of control you would use. And it does give you the ability to let's see, I'm trying to remember the specific properties that are associated with it, so let's bring them up here. Yes, here we go. The Q text allows you to populate the little default information that appears here. This isn't actual text. It won't be what's searched. It's kind of almost like a hidden label that's in there to guide the user as to what the purpose of that control is for. All right, and going back. Oh, and the last one that's used for inputs is the file uploader control, which I think I did use in another webinar. And this control is used in conjunction with a few other controls to allow you to select files and then upload them to your the server that's running your web application. This particular control provides a list and built-in plus and minus buttons that can be used to add or remove files to the list. And then typically you add a companion button to your layout that says something like upload, and that button in its action event handler calls the upload method of the file uploader control, which then uploads the files through the browser to your web server. And I think I do have an example of that you can see here. Something like this with a companion button here that just calls the upload method. And then the file uploader control itself has events for when files are added and when the upload has finished, so that you can then save off the uploaded files down to a location on your web server so they can be used later. All right, let's try another web page for our next grouping of controls. So now we're to the decor or decorations group, and these are controls that generally the user doesn't typically interact with. They're often for displaying information of some kind. The canvas control doesn't look like much when you drag it to the web page. It's just kind of a blank canvas, if you will. But this allows you to draw graphics. So much like with desktop applications, the canvas control can be used to create custom controls that you draw to the screen yourself. They can also be used for things like graphics. Now let's open up a couple to show some of the things it can do. This very simple one just draws a bunch of boxes in the canvas. Random boxes and random sizes, whatnot. And you can see that is all done using the paint event handler. as you might expect, and if you're familiar with this on the desktop side, also how it works there. And you can see it's just doing a bunch of silly little random drawings. And I also have this one here, draws an actual graph. So something that can be handy for a more business type of web application that wants to display information back to the user. You can see this particular one is just drawing a nice grid in the background and then highlighting some data on the graph so the user can visualize it more clearly. And this particular one also actually is interactive because it's checking for mouse clicks in certain areas and allowing me to click on points and then displaying additional information. So it starts to show you some of the more powerful things you can build using a canvas control. And you can see Paint Event has a fair amount of code here that deals with drawing that graph. And the mouse up has code to check what was clicked and mark certain things so that the paint can draw, again, the values and the slightly larger box around it or whatnot. But it doesn't look like much in the layout editor, it's just the blank canvas. Moving from the canvas, one of the more powerful controls, next is the label, which is probably one of the simplest controls. Label doesn't do much except display text. Generally, text displayed in this manner is not meant for the user to interact with in any way. It's informational. You can turn on multi-line if you have a lot of information to show, so that if you stretch it, the text would wrap with multiple lines. But that's pretty much all you use the label for. Labels are very common. You often are going to need to provide some information to explain to the user what the heck your layouts are about, and that's ideally what a label is for. The link control is a web link, and this you just enter a URL, and it will take the user to that URL. In effect, it will also leave your web application because this is an external URL, and that's going to often replace the current browser window with whatever the user happened to click. You can tweak that by changing the target parameter. But this sort of thing can be useful if you want to redirect people back to your website or to a discussion forum, things like that. It's a nice, quick, and easy way to do that. And you can actually use this in your own web apps if you want to have it fire off your own code rather than fire a URL. You can just, if I remember properly, I think you just put in a bogus URL, something like a pound or something like that in the URL field, and that prevents any URL from being processed, and then you can implement like the mouse up or mouse down event handlers, and then call your own Xojo code. And sometimes that's useful because links are commonly used in a lot of web apps to initiate or kick off actions, and sometimes you may want to use that instead of a button. Lastly, the rectangle and separator. Even more of a blank slate than the canvas, a rectangle is just a box. Sometimes people might use this to get a background and to lay out things more nicely. Looks like I need to change the bring to front. Where is that up here? Frontmost, there we go. Change the layering so that that shows in front, but you can notice there's no parenting that you would see on the desktop side where, I've dragged the control onto another one and you get that red grouping. And if I were to move this, it doesn't move what you might think is the child here. Everything kind of is on the same level from that aspect. There's just the Z height, if you will, the back to order layering that you can control. But this can allow you to format your layouts a little bit to give some grouping aspects. Very simple. But you can take advantage of styles with a rectangle to create, different background colors, change the corners and create more rounded things, even create circles. So it can be a lot faster if you do have to put in any sort of color or this sort of stuff to use a rectangle in conjunction with styles to tweak it than to load up actual graphics. Because the styles are just much smaller, load up much faster. Graphics, of course, are bigger depending on how you size them or whatnot, and are going to load up more slowly. And the separator doesn't do really anything except give you a nice horizontal line that you can use and stretch to separate different areas of your user interface. So nothing much with a separator, but good to know it's there. Sometimes it can be pretty handy. All right, that's another web page here. Oh, what ones are we up to? Our indicators. And there's 3 that are listed here, 2 which are, again, variations on a theme. The progress wheel is just a little spinner, and this spins whenever it's visible. So generally speaking, if you're using one of these things, and these things are used when your app is doing something and you want to let the user know that that's busy thinking or whatnot, and you get this little spinning animation that appears, and you add it to your layout. You set it to invisible, and then when you're ready to do something, you set it visible. Now remember, because of the way that web applications work, because they're asynchronous, if you would do something like set it to visible at the beginning of a method, do all your work, and then set it to invisible at the end, you might think, okay, that will start the spinner spinning, the method will do its thing, and then it will stop the spinner spinning at the end. It doesn't work that way, because with web apps, your method is sent to the server to run in one chunk. So all that code is going to run on the server in one chunk, and the spinner will never actually have a chance to start spinning. So if you really do want to have your spinner start spinning, you need to kick it off kind of in 2 steps. Often a timer might be a good way to do that, so that you'd have a button press that starts a process. Maybe the button press starts the spinner by making it visible, and then kicks off a timer that a moment later will actually kick off the long-running process. But you have to split it into multiple steps so that everything gets sent to the server and a UI request gets sent back. Progress bar is similar, although more often used when you have a more precise idea of how many things are being processed or how long something might take, because you can give it a maximum value so that you can kind of chug along and keep track of how much of the progress has been completed. And you would fill that in just by changing the value property as your code is running. And as you tweak it, it fills in the percent based on whatever the maximum value is. And of course, there is a variation on the progress bar, the indeterminate progress bar, which, like a spinner, that doesn't actually show anything in the layout editor, isn't going to tell you how long things might be expected to take. It's just going to essentially give the statement that says, hey, I'm busy. And this shows a kind of a full-on thing. It varies by platform, of course, but it's a kind of a continuously moving bar. I am not displaying the right page, so let's go back. Which page are we up to? 4. So you can see the continuous spinner, this thing here. Actually, I don't even see any sort of animation at the moment on that one. I don't know if that's a browser issue or what, but that is its purpose in life. All right, time for a new web page. Now we're up to the viewers section. List box is a very commonly used control to display lists of data. You can control the columns, widths of individual columns, the headings. You can do all that using the built-in editor. You can add default rows. As you can see here, you can turn on whether or not heading actually is displayed as a heading. If you turn off the heading, then the data I entered becomes the first default row. All that sort of stuff. You can control row colors. There are additional properties you can set for individual cells and whatnot using styles, which is all nice and handy. There are not quite as many events and methods available on the web list box as there are on the desktop. On the desktop one's been around for a long time. Incredibly powerful control with lots of stuff. This one doesn't quite have that much capability just yet, but it's a great way to present information back to your user and in a nice list format for them to see things. Let's take a quick look. I think I have an example here. You can see how that might look. Pretty standard. Here we can add rows to the list box, click on them, get the information, display it back in there. That sort of thing. All right. Go back to this window. All right, so that's the list box. Definitely one of the controls you're going to want to take advantage of. There's also an HTML viewer control that can be used to display essentially a website within your web application. You just give it a URL, and it will display the information. If you have HTML as a string or something, you can also send it to this to have it displayed, which is very handy for referencing stuff that might be outside your web application. The image well is just for displaying simple graphics. In many cases, you may find that it just makes sense to use a canvas instead of an image well, but image well is nice and simple and focused. You can just drag it on there and set it to a particular picture that happens to be in your project, or actually a URL of a picture. So it's a little simpler to use than a canvas, not as flexible, but if you just have a single graphic that you need to display, this would be the control to use. I'm going to kind of talk about both the movie player and the YouTube movie player together here. The movie player control will let you play movies that you have hosted somewhere in your web application, which is very handy. You want to refer to the language reference for the specific particular formats that are available to you. It varies a little bit depending on the browser, because not all the browsers have set up compatible formats that they can play. Some browsers can play MPEG files, some require OGG Vorbis, some require some other standard. I think the browsers are starting to come together so that they're all going to start to support the same file types. But if you do intend to support a large variety of browsers, it may mean that you need your videos encoded in more than one format. So that is something to keep in mind. The YouTube movie player is somewhat related, but it's more focused, of course. It can only play movies that are hosted on YouTube. You just drag in your control, and then in the inspector, you can give it the URL to the YouTube movie. Unfortunately, you cannot give it the URL to the short link of the YouTube movie, which is usually something like u.ube or something when you go to the sharing page. That URL itself won't work. You actually have to use the longer URL that is followed by Let me just look up what I have here, which has the full youtube.com address followed by a parameter string. So if we do an example of that, too many slashes. All right, so finally got to our YouTube channel here. All right, so if I pick just a YouTube video, this short one here, I don't need it to start playing. If I were to go to the share button, you'd see that there's a, uncheck this. If I uncheck that, you'd get this little short URL here. So it's u2.be. I had the final part wrong. This URL won't actually work with the YouTube movie player control. You actually have to use the long URL, which is what you can see here, which has the full YouTube plus this watch parameter, and then the V, and then the name of the video. Unfortunately, it also includes the rest of this other crap for playlists and whatnot, which you don't need. So you can just, remove that. You really only need the part up to here, well, from here to the beginning. But that is an important thing you have to remember. I don't believe I've updated the language reference with this information just yet, but I'll get it in there. So but that's what you need to do to get the YouTube movie player control to work. But if you do host your movies elsewhere, which can make a lot of sense because of all the things you can put on your website, movies are going to probably suck down the most bandwidth. So if you're hosting them elsewhere, and something like YouTube is a very popular place to host these sort of things, you can use this control to make them easily accessible to your users. And the last one that's in here is the map viewer, which if we put on here, again in the layout editor, doesn't look like much, but this displays a Google Maps control that allows you to display locations. This is one of the examples that I often do with my intro to Xojo webinars, but got a more complicated one here. And you can see it has a fair amount of control. I mean, by default, it has built-in Google Maps functionality for zooming and controlling the type of maps you see, satellite versus just a map or whatnot. And you can type in addresses, and they are found. And I don't exactly remember how this particular demo works. Oh, yeah, click on it to drop a pin. So all some neat little stuff you can do with this particular control. Very handy for a certain type of web applications where you do need to show something on the map. All right, I'm scanning my question list here. It doesn't look like I've seen any questions come in. Everybody's nodding off at this webinar. I think I've gone through all the controls. I'm just scanning my list here, make sure I didn't jump around and miss any. No, that covered all the controls I wanted to. Many of these examples that I did go through are included with Xojo in the examples folder here on the web area. The controls folder has several, in addition to many others that I didn't get a chance to go through, as did the container folder and the graphics folder. But certainly check out all those for more specifics on how to use some of these controls. I am going to try and get more examples in there of the specific controls. I do have a project I'm working on that attempts to have all the controls in a single project So you can play around with them and see how they work, and good for demo purposes. Let's see. Oh, a few questions have popped in here, so let me take a look. Make my window a little bigger so I can see them. All right. Terry's asking if the map can show multiple addresses at the same time. And yeah, you can certainly do that. As you can see, even when we ran this example, I was able to drop multiple pins on the map in different places. I mean, that's the extent of the multiple locations it's going to show, the same way that a Google map would. Essentially, the map control has two methods that allow you to do that. One is a go-to location method that recenters the map on a specific location. And then the other one is the add location method, which essentially is what drops these pins down so you can mark multiple locations on the map. Let's see. Fotis is asking if it's possible to have a button with multiple lines of text as its caption. I do not believe that you can do that. I don't think any of the browsers would support that. That would be the sort of thing that you're probably, if you do require that, you're probably going to have to build your own custom button. I'm just going to try that real quick, but I don't expect that to work. Actually, I don't even know how you'd enter the multiple lines. You've only really got, well, you could try it here and see. Now, just because something shows here in the inspector doesn't mean that it necessarily will render in the browser properly. And of course, without the right page selected, we'll never know what got rendered in the browser. So let's to web page 5. Yeah, as you can see, that's web browsers are not rendering the HTML break when it's within a button. So that's not going to work. You're going to have to render that out yourself using your own control. Probably a canvas would work just fine for that. Let's see here. Craig is asking if it's possible to have a web app communicate with another Xojo app, like a console app. Yeah, absolutely. Of course, that console app does have to be running on the web server along with the web app. But if that's the case, you can absolutely have the two communicating with each other. You could have the web app launch these console apps as shells to kick off background processes that would be able to take advantage of additional CPUs, much like you can do with a desktop app. So that definitely works. So yeah, but the important thing is that these things all have to be running on the server together. You can't, have a console app that's running on some user's client computer and then expect your web app to be able to communicate with it. That's not going to work. There is other communication you can do, of course, using the application handle special URL event handler that would allow other applications, desktop or other web applications, to communicate to this web application by sending HTTP requests, and then you being able to respond by sending information back. Julian is asking if the map viewer lets you pass latitude and longitude attributes to locate an area on the map. Offhand, I do not know the answer to that. You can maybe check in the docs, see if that's obvious. Generally speaking, I don't know latitude and longitudes off the top of my head, but it looks like there are properties for that. That appear like they would do. Oh, and there's also a constructor that lets you, yes, yeah, that would make sense. So yeah, you would create a new web map location using the constructor that lets you supply in the latitude and longitude. So that makes the most obvious sense. I've only ever used it by supplying in a string address, because those I do generally know. But yeah, if you happen to do have the latitude and longitude, just use the constructor to pull that in. and get an address that you can then display on the map. And Terry is asking, speaking of the map control, can the drop pins be based on an address? And yes, absolutely. The web map, actually I brought up the web map location. Let me bring up both of these. But the web map viewer works in conjunction with web map location. So really, the web map viewer displays locations. And you do it by calling the add location method or the go to location method. Add location drops a pin, go to location centers the map on that particular location. And then the locations are web map locations that you can specify using all this stuff here. So you can create as many web map locations as you want, and then drop as many pins as you want on the map. Let's see here. Mark is asking if there's a scroll bar control or does the browser handle that for you? Well, they're both. There is a scroll bar control, which I think I don't know if I left on any of these windows here, but it is right here in towards the top. The two vertical and horizontal scroll bars are right here. Certainly, sometimes it's handier just to have the browser deal with that. And if that's the case, often it makes the most sense to also use a container in conjunction and do your layout inside a container. Put the container on the page, and then tell the container to enable the scrolling. So right here, you can control the type of scroll bars that appear for the container, automatic, always or never, that allow you, if there's more information in the container than would appear in the browser window, then the container gets its own scroll bar. Let's see, Justin is asking how you might remotely debug a web application. Well, the easiest way to remotely debug a web application is to not actually remotely debug it, but to remotely run it. Because it's a web application, you can, of course, run it anywhere. You can see when you run the web application, it's still a URL right here. Now this is localhost, but I could look up the actual IP of my system here, which would be 10.0.1.9. So I could go to a different device that happens to be on my local network. I could grab an iPad or an iPhone, for example, or another computer, my laptop, and type in 10.0.1.9:8080, and this same page would come up on that other device. That would allow me to test with a different browser, test on a mobile device or whatnot. And because it's still connected to the web app that happens to be running right here, right now, it would work just fine through the debugger. So that often is sufficient for most debugging purposes. If you actually have to run the web app, though, on a different system, right now it's running on OS 10, and for example, if you did have to run it on Linux to do your debugging, you can still use the remote debugger for that, but generally you're trying to remember, you're going to want to use the console one, if I remember correctly. There is a console remote debugger that's in the folder, the extras folder of Xojo, along with the regular GUI remote debugger that will run this console application on the different platform so that you could kind of do the reverse and punch in the URL wherever you want to. So you can connect to it and do your debugging that way. But I'd say 99% of the time, maybe even higher than 99% of the time, I'm just typing in the URL on whatever other devices I want to actually test out. Let's see. Terry's asking if it's possible to have this web map viewer in a desktop app. Well, not this particular control. There is a an example included with Xojo that does show you how you can display a Google Maps map in a desktop application. And that probably would be the first place to start. I forget exactly where it is. Certainly one of it is in the Eddie's Electronics desktop example. Has a map that's displayed in there, so you can see in there. And I really thought there might be one in here, but I don't recall off the top of my head. I bet this is it right here, Internet Google Maps. Yeah, this is an example of how you could display Google Maps in a desktop application by using an HTML viewer. So you can check out that project if you need that capability. Let's see, going back to Justin, he was noting some issues with running the console remote debugger when logged out on a Mac. Yeah, that's possible. I can't say I've done a heck of a lot of testing using the console remote debugger in that situation. And I don't think we've gotten a heck of a lot of feedback regarding the console remote debugger, so I'm not sure how many people are actually using it. So certainly, Justin, if you are using that more extensively and have any glitches or issues you're noting, by all means, get those in feedback so we can get those reviewed, replicated, and taken care of. All right, great. Seem to have caught up with the questions that are on here, which matches up good with the amount of time. Next week, of course, is the Xojo Developer Conference, so there is no regularly scheduled webinar on Tuesday. That doesn't mean we won't be doing something next week. I'll see how time permits, and maybe I'll have a last-minute fun little thing that I'll be doing live from Las Vegas. We'll see. No promises. But I know I'll be seeing plenty of you that have been in my webinars in Las Vegas, so that'll be great. I look forward to meeting everyone. And certainly if you are not already following us on Twitter or Facebook, by all means, you'll want to do so you can stay on top of any news that comes out next week. Personally, I tend to use Twitter. I don't really use Facebook much. And Twitter's, a little lower overhead than Facebook. It's easier to stay on top of, I think. So by all means, follow us there so you can be staying on top of our news and whatnot. Looking here at the page, looks like we've got it's about 2,200 followers. That seems low. I'd like to get that a lot higher. Wonder how we can do that. All right, get everyone you know to follow us on Twitter, and I'll be a happy guy. All right. And lastly, I want to remind everyone of two other things. Xojo Cloud, which I'm sure we'll be talking about and showing a lot at the conference next week, did come out very recently, last week actually. And so certainly it's an incredibly easy and fast way to deploy your Xojo web applications. You want to read more about it, check it out, and look into it. But literally one-click web hosting. As you can see, there's a nice deploy button in the toolbar, and you just click it, and your web app is compiled and uploaded to the server, and then instantly available for people to use, all within just a minute or so. And of course, our forum is a great place, forum.xojo.com, for you to ask, discuss, and talk about Xojo. So by all means, head on over there and join the wonderful Xojo community and chat with everyone. And of course, I'm sure we'll also have XDC related news appearing on our forum as well. So I want to thank everyone for attending this week. And don't worry, if you're not able to make our conference next week, the webinar the week after, when we return, will essentially be focused on a recap of what happened at the conference and open question and answer for people to ask questions. So thank you everyone for attending this week, and have a great rest of your day.